Hey everybody. Just wanted to give you a quick update on the status of the podcast for the month of April. So I've got 4 episodes in the can and I've got quite a few more scheduled over the next few weeks. And I'm really excited about the selection of guests that I'm going to be featuring in the near future. It's funny because I feel like I get a little bit more bolder with each round of invites, and I'm always really surprised and pleasantly surprised with who ends up saying yes. So, that being said, April's going to be a big change of schedule for me. I'm doing a family trip and then likely, fingers crossed, a meditation retreat, which together will likely take up most of the month and not leave me much time for editing and sharing new episodes. So with that in mind, I don't think I'm going to be releasing any new episodes until May, which also means if you're a Patreon subscriber, I'll pause billing for that month. So I kind of wanted to share with you a little bit about how I've been thinking about the podcast and how I've been approaching the podcast lately. I feel like I've really been lowering my inhibitions when it comes to deciding who to invite, which I should make very, very clear, doesn't mean lowering my standards. If I get excited about inviting a certain guest, I try not to encumber that process much more than just the excitement. I may wait a few weeks or something, but if I still feel the interest, I go for it. And that means that some guests are going to seem like really, really out there. And I often imagine them scratching their heads when they get emails from me, kind of reading my convoluted justifications of why they should come on my podcast. But, they still seem to be saying yes. So that's pretty cool. But I feel like this is the right way to do how to be an artist. Making art is as much about the approach. It's about the mindset. And it's really about how you make discoveries more than it's about some sort of end finished product. So this project for me from the beginning has really been a very personal one. And I'm pretty stoked that people want to kind of go along the ride with me and kind of follow the exploration. But I'm really trying to sort something out in my life. And I'm trying to do it in a way that doesn't really rely on past comforts or crutches. Just reaching out to people to do podcasts and talking to people that are basically strangers or people that I really admire has been an enormous challenge for me. This is something where I've dealt with social anxiety much of my life. And I remember when I was younger and even up into much of my adulthood, the idea of just calling someone on the phone caused huge amounts of anxiety for me. And it made me just kind of avoid that as much as possible. But one of the interesting things that happens with self-introspection and some contemplative work is that I've noticed the social anxiety has become more manageable, and it's felt like this is something I can take on more. And I just notice the more and more that I do it, the easier it gets and kind of the more fun I'm having with it. But in general, I'm really trying to do things right now that are at the edge of my comfort zone and the edge of my social, spiritual and intellectual limits. So I've started doing some blogging, and some of you may have read some of this. I've got a Medium page where you can read some of the things I'm writing, and I feel a huge amount of insecurity about that writing. Basically that I'm not staying in my lane, that I'm rambling about stuff that I have no business rambling about. But also I want people to respond to it. I want to get better at what I'm doing, and I want to get better at thinking through the things that I'm thinking about. So I'd love to get more responses to that, and I totally invite really difficult responses that point out where my thinking needs to be a little more thorough. It's funny, I read this passage. I just finished reading The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham. And it describes, at some point, I can't remember who's talking, but it describes this man who basically impoverished his family in order to create this pseudoscientific and pseudo-philosophical tome that no one ended up reading. And there's definitely part of me that wonders if that isn't where I'm headed. But the fact that I'm so scared about that and I'm so uncomfortable about that is kind of a good thing. And it's kind of encouraging that I actually get excited about being uncomfortable and scared. And I know some of you may have come from past channels I've created, particularly like my YouTube channel, where my focus has been very different from this. Although I definitely was dipping my toe in this stuff the whole time. You can see it in a lot of my content in the past. And I don't know what you want for my channel. I don't really know if this seems like kind of weird or a mismatch with what you might expect from a podcast for me. Maybe you prefer that I talk to like these all-star artists about how they broke into the business and overcame all the other art hurdles that you want to overcome. And it's exciting for you just to see that kind of fantasy of like what it would be like to work as an artist. And maybe there's kind of this fun of participating by proxy in this like kind of clique of artists. I'm still going to do my best to talk to lots of very skilled artists, but I'm not interested in fantasy. I really want to be clear that artists are human and that making art is part of being human. And that means paying attention to all this stuff in the periphery that seems to have nothing to do with art, but that deserves artistry just as much as the stuff that may end up on the comic page or whatever your medium is. So, if that's not your cup of tea, that's totally cool. I totally get it. And I really appreciate you, supporting my YouTube channel and sticking with me up to this point. If you do get amped by this direction, well, I think things are going to get more interesting, only more interesting in the future. Still don't know how close I am to finding answers, but asking questions so far is pretty fun. Regardless, I really want to know what you guys feel about the podcast. I want you guys to be as open as you can with me and really share kind of your responses. And I have some kind of interesting ideas about how we might be able to make this whole thing like more communal. Like, I'm not interested in making a podcast being something like being some sort of broadcast superstar. Like, Joe Rogan is cool and all, and I think there's a lot you can learn from watching his podcast. But I don't think that's really what I'm interested in doing. And I'm much more interested in having like a discussion than having an audience. So if you have a response, if you, like me, sometimes find yourself listening to a podcast and kind of talking back to the podcast, like, make that an actual conversation. Send me an actual message. Tell me what you think, how you're feeling, how you're responding to it, and let's talk more. So anyway, with that in mind, let's start today's episode. How to be an artist. Step 24. Growing your own food. With guest, Dustin Hansen. Dustin, welcome back. You've got the dubious honor of being the first return guest on How to Be an Artist.
Wow. I don't even know what to say. I'm super honored.
You deserve a medal.
Good. Well, I've really enjoyed the show so far. I'm totally caught up, and I've
awesome.
really enjoyed the podcast. They've been really fun.
Very cool. Well, I really appreciate you helping to set the tone. I think the first episode was definitely one where people were like, "Hey, we want to hear more of that."
Oh, very cool.
We're doing it. We're following it up. We're extending the conversation. That's what we're here for.
Great. That sounds fun.
So, tell me a little bit about what you've been working on. What's interesting to you lately?
Yeah, winter. I'm a real seasonal guy.
Yeah.
Winter for me is heavy writing time, and I try to. Yeah, I really try to balance my schedule so that's when I'm putting in my heavy writing time. And so in the last few months, I've actually finished the draft of 2 completely separate books. So
cool.
Yeah, it's just kind of like pounding on words and doing this stuff like that. I just finished a book going to be called The Greatest Stories Ever Played. And it's really about the evolution of technology and storytelling and how those two things have converged and how storytelling has kind of changed global literacy and how technology's played a part in that. And
so nonfiction.
Yeah, nonfiction book. Yeah. And it's definitely focused around video games. I mean, it's really kind of hitting what video games are doing now that's different than other storytelling mediums are or have done in the past, and how technology plays a part in that. So that one is finished, and then I have a fiction one that I'm just barely wrapping up too. So yeah, winter is like I said, when it snows outdoors, I'm pounding on the keys. So that
sounds like a good way to do it. Is this other one, is it graphic novel or is it like straight fiction, prose?
It's prose, but it has big illustrated sections.
Oh, nice.
So
I like that.
Kind of alternates between non-written verbal or visual communication in the illustrated sections and then prose in the written sections.
Yeah, I've kind of decided this year one of the things I'm really working on is writing. Like, I just want to really switch my emphasis to writing. So I've been doing some daily writing so far this year and doing kind of a switch between like essay writing and trying to do like some short story writing. So I just a couple of days ago finished the first draft of my first short story that I've probably that I've ever written or probably since college. So and And I gave it to my daughter, and she's like, "Yeah, it gets kind of boring around here." So I'm like, "Okay, second draft."
That's great. Yeah, I felt like writing is such a unique thing to do, and it's such a solitary endeavor most of the time that
Mm-hmm.
it's and it's hard to see immediately. Like I like the immediate feedback I get from visual stuff,
Uh-huh.
and a lot of people can kind of comment on visual art and pull up things that I miss. But writing takes it takes a different level of interest to be able to give somebody feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So I find it very solitary. Um,
That's true.
and so it's nice to have someone have like a daughter that can read it and say this is boring. Like that's such great feedback to get.
That's true. Yeah, I know what you mean because it's kind of like art. It's so visceral. People can be like, this or that. But when you're trying to get feedback on writing, you kind of really have to push it out there. And I know when people have asked me to like read their stuff, it is kind of like, oh, okay, I gotta like, turn up the energy to do this, right?
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
and if you do stuff that's like novel length, asking someone to read that for you,
geez,
that's a big commitment. Um,
yeah.
yeah, so I usually end up asking the same people every time, which is usually my
Hmm.
poor wife who reads everything I write. But at some point, even that becomes part of the process to the point where it's so integrated. I can almost outguess what she's going to say.
Hmm.
So it's hard to find a reader that'll dive in and read, a 50 to 70,000 word novel.
Jeez. Oh yeah, for sure. But yeah, some good feedback can be like precious, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you have this experience, but I find a lot of times, as soon as I like hand something over to someone for feedback, it turns on a certain switch in my mind that immediately I'm thinking about it from someone else's perspective. And sometimes just the handoff is enough to suddenly have this critical layer that wasn't there before, you know?
Oh, absolutely. And whenever I send anything like to an editor,
Mm-hmm.
I've learned this from past mistakes of sending it off
Mm-hmm.
the first time thinking I'm all ready and then regretting because I sent it too early. So I usually kind of give myself a false deadline and I say, okay, I'm going to send it, like on the first, knowing my deadline's the 10th. So they have a few days to just think about it. And
Yeah.
invariably just knowing that, if I'm going to send it to someone that's kind of like a final pass kind of thing, I'll always go back and change things. Um,
Yeah.
it's probably an OCD thing for me a little bit too. I know I hold on to stuff too long and I overthink and overprocess stuff and
Mm-hmm.
but yeah.
Well, there is such thing as underthinking stuff too.
Yes,
So
there is.
you get really excited and you're like, I think this is good. And you send it off and then you realize it's full of typos. And I do that quite a bit.
Yeah, me too.
Well, that's cool. I definitely will have to pick your brain about some of the writing stuff too, because it's definitely like I feel like wow, I have a lot to learn. I'm sitting down doing this and like seeing all the challenges that come up as you do it, and so yeah.
Yeah, this year's been interesting for me just because of one book that I found.
Hmm.
That's definitely worth bringing up. I after like I've this is my ninth book that's coming out, and I wish I would have read
Wow.
this book before I started because it's really changed my approach to both theme and kind of the real stakes behind fiction and even kind of back to that evolution thing. Why do we love stories? Is it biological?
Yeah.
It's a book called Story Genius by Lisa
Okay.
Caron.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm looking at doing too. Is I just want to start doing some study just on story again. What's the main premise of that? How's that being helpful to you?
This one for me was well her understanding of why story is important. I think
Hmm.
was the different take that I'd had from some of the maybe more academic versions of what story is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and one other thing is that she's a fantastic editor. So
Hmm.
she comes from this wealth of experience that I admired already,
Interesting.
and then just her approach to the importance of like immediate res. What
Hmm.
happened before the story started, and how much
Okay.
do you really know about the character before you begin the book, and those type of things, and whether or not you expose those to the reader are
Mm-hmm.
kind of up to you as the writer, but you darn well better know them. And it's made me question some things with my current book that I was on. So that was great. I just really loved it.
I'm thinking about that because the story I'm writing right now is like it's mostly stuff happening, but the characters are pretty thin, you know. And there's part of me that's like, I don't want to overdo it on character too. Like I love the stuff where it's just like you have the barest hint that tells you what a character is, right? But
Yeah,
it's enough to
I love
propel the
that.
story. But at least right now, there's nothing much going on with my characters. It's like a really interesting premise, really boring characters. That's how I kind of think about it right now. So, well, that's cool, man. Well, the real meat of what I wanted to dig into today, which probably sounds like a big diversion from the topic of art. But yeah, you had posted something on Twitter, tweeted something on Twitter, maybe I can't remember how long, a month or so ago, or must have been more than that because as at the end of the summer. But you were just talking about how much of your food in the summer you had grown,
Yeah.
and you said you quoted some huge percentage, and I was just like dumbfounded. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like that much of your food you grew yourself? What was it? Did you say 70%?
Yeah, it's about 70% in the summer months. I think the big thing that I posted that made people kind of respond to it is I said I spent $21 to feed a family of 6
Yeah, that's
in
amazing.
August. But if I'm really being honest, that's not really that honest. Haha,
Hmm.
used honest twice. Because, I did have things in the house like oil and, like vegetable oil, olive oil, stuff like
Sure.
that, flour, sugar. So it's not a very good metric. And I've actually sensed kind of, I'm being way more critical about my food budget this year so that I can have some better information on what the real costs are.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it really wasn't even a financial endeavor
Hmm.
initially. But yeah, it's definitely it's turned in from what was a hobby that I loved. I've always enjoyed gardening
Uh-huh.
to something that I feel a much deeper connection than just a simple hobby.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I really love it.
Yeah, I've always felt I have kind of these two different like visions, these two different fantasies. And one is like the urban fantasy. And I've talked a lot about that, I think, on this podcast and other
Mm-hmm.
places. But and I think there's justification for it. Like there's benefits for living in an urban setting. And the other fantasy, and I think I'm not alone here, is kind of like, yeah, to be able to have a homestead, to be able to like grow your own food and have like some sort of direct connection to the things that keep you alive instead of being part of some sort of like abstract system where you don't know where your food is coming. You go to the store to get your food, right?
Yeah.
So that's definitely something I've thought a lot about. And my yard's pretty small, so I'm limited. We try to do as much as we can, but we're pretty limited with what we can grow. But then it's funny, we were going to do this podcast and schedule, things came up. This is like the third time that we finally did it. But just this past week, I listened to this other podcast. It's called Damn the Absolute. I'm trying to find the name of the guy that hosts it. I should listen to. Oh, Jeffrey Howard. There it is.
There we
Okay.
go. Yeah.
So Damn the Absolute, hosted by this guy named Jeffrey Howard, has some really interesting discussions. But the most recent one I listened to was with Ashley Colby, who writes about subsistence agriculture in the United States. And I was like, oh my gosh, this totally relates to the stuff I want to talk with Dustin about. And then come to find you are actually reading her book, right?
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. Right now. And when you sent me the podcast, I was going to listen to it, but I haven't finished the book yet.
Yeah.
So I haven't listened to the podcast. So I'll be honest about that and admit it, but I'll definitely listen to it later.
So anyway, tell me about tell me how you found the book, how you were drawn to it, and what your interest is in it.
Yeah, well, I think for me, it's kind of probably a long story. I guess that's what podcasts are for. So, okay.
That's what we do here.
Right. So I live in Ephraim, Utah, which is pretty rural Utah.
Yeah.
It's 5,000 people and 7,500 when the college is in session. It's that kind of size of place. And I had lived here. We'd lived here for 4 or 5 years, and then I took a job in Rhode Island and moved my family to Rhode Island, where it is not rural. Yeah, that's when I worked with Hasbro.
Yeah,
which was the opposite of rural, right? And so we had a pretty big shift. Our my family did, of having a yard that we gardened as kind of like hobbyists, and we enjoyed it. It was more like flavor kind of thing, right? Like fresh tomatoes taste better than store tomatoes. It was that kind of gardening, which has a lot of value too, by the way, even nutritional value. But it was just interesting to me that that's where we were at before. And then moving to Rhode Island kind of changed my perspective because I didn't have the climate that I was used to gardening in.
Mm-hmm.
I lost another 2 weeks on each side of summer, and it was just a colder climate, and boy, just nobody gardened there. It was crazy. Like
Really? That's so
nobody.
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I had a really hard time finding a community of gardeners. So that lack of community of gardening was kind of the first thing that made me kind of question, because I realized that I did have one in Ephraim when I grew there. Just friends that had gardened with me, or that we talked about kind of gardening and different ways to do things, and so that was a part of it, was that community.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that happened during that same time is when we moved back to Ephraim. When we moved back, Walmart had been in Ephraim for probably about 10 years at the
Mm-hmm.
time. And when we moved back, there was a supermarket down here called Kent's Market. There was a small market that was down here. There was a small hardware store. There was all kinds of kind of like small local businesses. And
Yeah.
I saw Walmart completely push them out.
Really?
Yeah.
It's a story I've heard before, but I mean, you actually kind of got to watch it in real time.
Oh, absolutely. And
Wow.
matter of fact, the store, the market that was down here, that Kent's Market, they were living on such an absolute, like they had to push their profits so low, their margins so low. They had a small fire in their like deli section,
Mm-hmm.
and it pushed them out of business. Like
Wow.
they couldn't afford to repair enough to get over one simple mistake.
Yeah.
So they closed their doors. And the main thing that I saw that happened after that is that both prices went up at Walmart. It was evident, like overnight, prices went up. But the
Yeah.
bigger thing is that both variety went down. Like you can't buy anything there. It's like really limited, and I just thought, man, we live in such an immediate food culture
Mm-hmm.
where if you buy chicken at Walmart, it was alive yesterday. Um, the chicken was alive, maybe 2 days ago,
Yeah.
which is all fine and dandy. But when you stretch that out and say, well, what if we went 2 weeks without chicken being shipped to Walmart?
Yeah.
Um, it was kind of that.
Exactly.
That's kind of where this whole thing started for me. So it's, even though it started as a hobby and something that I enjoyed, it moved more to this concept of how dependent I was on trucking. I mean, that's
Yep.
really what it came down to.
Yeah. Wait, so when did this happen again? How long ago was this?
4 years ago, probably.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Because I think a
So
lot of people have had a similar wake up call with the pandemic,
I do too.
but it's good that it started earlier for you.
Yeah, and I just think I was in a unique experience. Being
Yeah.
down here and seeing all those stores close and all that kind of stuff. It was pretty crazy. And I grew up in the Mormon culture
Mm-hmm.
where in the 80s and 90s, all we would hear is food storage, food storage, food
Mm-hmm.
storage.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty common for people to say, "Do you have a year of food storage for your entire family, or sometimes two?" Which is kind of the
Does anyone
unrealistic
actually
dream.
have that?
No, I mean it would take so much space,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so I kind of really looked at that concept and kind of the benefit to that type of concept. And what I realized is what I really needed was I needed the knowledge to be able to create food
Mm.
a
Mm.
year at a time. Because it's not feasible for me. I have a pretty good sized family. I have 4 kids. They're still living with me. Even though
Mm-hmm.
a couple of them move them out pretty quick, but we have, like, that's a lot of food,
Yeah.
to store it, and then do people really eat stored food, and all those kinds of questions kind of
Yeah.
came into play, and so I decided I have to learn how to do things that I never thought I would really enjoy, and I really do, which is growing my own meat and especially
Wow.
chickens and those type of things, and processing it and learning that process and knowing what the cost of that was and knowing what they ingest and all of those type of things. And it's completely changed. It's completely changed my entire family's eating habits, and kind of how we approach food and how we approach land.
Hmm.
And but probably the most interesting thing is the growth of community that's happened for me with that. And I'm a real introvert type of guy.
Wow.
Um, but to meet other people who have been doing this for years and can really teach me how to do stuff properly, and give me good warnings and things to watch out for, has been invaluable. It's been great. And the real reason that happens is because there's only really two places to buy chicken food in our county,
Hmm.
and so those are the people I run into.
Yeah. Interesting.
It's really fascinating.
It's like the IFA. Is that where you're going?
Yeah, IFA. Then there's a Tractor Supply place here down here too. And so you
That's
go to one of those two places and you meet people.
yeah. That's so interesting because I think in this podcast, I think Colby says the ways that she found one of the ways she found her contacts was like going to the feed store,
Oh, that's
and
so
she would
funny.
like she found all the like chicken farmers.
Yeah.
So is like how many acres are you doing all this on?
So I have I have like 1.7 acres.
Okay, that's not crazy.
No, it's not. It's pretty manageable, and
Yeah.
it's going to be perfect for my wife and I when it's just the two of us left. It'll
Yeah.
probably even be more than I will need.
Mm-hmm.
I I really only farm about a half an acre right now, and that's pretty. I know that's a lot. I recognize that. For me, that's a lot anyway.
Sure.
But it's very manageable. I'm super spoiled because I have water rights, so I can use irrigation rather than just
That's very
turn on the
cool.
hose.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that makes the price go down pretty dramatically.
You pumping out of like an adjacent stream or something, or
there's an irrigation ditch that I have to use in very specific times, and if I go over by 15 minutes, the farmer who lives next door to me will tell me. It's very
Good.
serious business down here. Water rights.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Jeez.
it's pretty serious, especially for like people who that is like their income. I can understand why. But yeah, it's pretty big deal. Water rights are pretty serious down here.
Yeah, there's an element of community there too, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Like, yeah, I got the like shared resource.
Yeah.
Yeah, that whole like element of community, that's like one thing that really struck me. And I think that's something that Colby mentions as well, is just kind of like the collaboration, the knowledge sharing. And she makes this point that I really, really like about ideology. And she's like, these communities aren't about like ideology. It's about like functional, here's this thing we want to get done. And that's kind of one of her recommendations, is like, you want to start something of import. Like you want to start with like functional goals and collaboration. You don't want to start with ideology, because that'll just like pull things to a screeching stop right at the beginning to say like, hey, let's make sure we all agree on the same ideology before we start raising chickens, right?
Right. Oh my gosh, that's such a good point.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things that I find here is that I don't align politically with the majority of the people in this community. I'm pretty liberal, and I'll just say there's a lot of red hats when I go to Walmart down here, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And those are the type of people that I know if I talk to them about politics, not irrigation, right? The conversation
Non-starter.
won't go the same direction. So actually, that's really an interesting point. I've never thought about that, but that's absolutely true, because I do have a common bond with some of these, hobby sustenance farmers like myself, and even like the SUU or the USU extension office down here. That's where you can go and get your soil tested and those type of things.
That's a pretty good resource.
Yeah, it is, and I bet you most towns in Utah have some form of that USU extension office.
Oh, really? Okay,
yeah.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah,
because that's where you get those resources.
Yeah, they're really great. You can get planting charts and all kinds of great stuff from them. Super helpful. No, I was just going to say it's interesting because I've never thought of it really in those terms, but there is something kind of nice about that you don't. I guess if we had to go and fight for rights to keep, luckily down here in Sanpete County, I don't have to go and fight for like livestock rights, right? If I wanted to, I could put a cow in my backyard. But if I had to go and fight for those rights with our city council, I would probably have a common bond with some people who I politically don't align with.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's something there too, as far as like how we solve some of the problems that we're facing, in our country. We have this like, extreme polarization that's emerging, but it's this very abstract polarization, because it's like mostly these people that we disagree with are these people some other place, Or,
Right.
either that or it's like our family members, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
that one uncle, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or whatever it is. Um, yeah, but I think that the kind of one of the problems that's happened is there's just been this trend of like atomization, uh, you know, isolation. Like we live in this world of like Netflix where, and I mean, gosh, COVID has made this so much worse where everyone's
Mhm.
stuck in their homes, interfacing with the world through this screen, rather than with their hands and their eyes and their feet.
Yeah.
And it seems like a nice way to kind of counteract that trend is like, I mean, just think about gardening is like, there's no more literal way for you to like interface with the real world, right?
Oh yeah.
To dig
Absolutely.
up dirt, plant living things in it.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt about it. And gardening has been something that's kind of helped my wife and I bond together too. Like we like to do that together too, and we kind of often have joked about that. Like I need to stick my hands in the dirt. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a thing we both feel this time of year, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I miss that. I crave that. Kind of
Yeah.
getting dirty and um, actually, it kind of probably sounded bad, but you know what I mean. About
Sure.
I just like to
Let's get dirty,
get
man.
dirty with my wife. But it is a really important part of that process too, and I've really enjoyed that with my kids as well. Some of them hate it, um,
Yeah.
which you know what, that's also really good. Um, and if this is the kind of thing, like to me, this takes a big amount of my time, a large amount of my
Mm-hmm.
time.
Yeah.
So if you don't like gardening, you shouldn't do it. I mean, just flat out, like there
Yeah.
are other things you
Yeah.
could be more productive at that are probably add equal value to your life and even to lives of others. Like I have so many eggs. Like I can't consume the amount of eggs that we have. So I give eggs away to a few people that are in town that that appreciate them. Right? Like
Yeah.
it's because even if those people could keep chickens, they wouldn't. Like they don't
Yeah.
like chickens. Like I get that. Um,
Well, it's surprising in the city how many people I know that keep chickens now in garden. I mean, that's definitely since COVID. I mean, all my
right.
neighbors garden. I have at least one other neighbor that has chickens. But it is a very empowering thing, especially like chickens.
Oh, they're amazing.
Chickens are so underrated.
They are
They're
the
like one of
best.
the most amazing things ever.
Yep, chickens and then goats. Like those two things are like the best. But
Ooh,
especially
so
chickens. Chickens are amazing.
yeah, I'll give you my like 2 bits on chickens, and you can
Yeah,
tell me about
yeah,
goats because
yeah.
I'm really interested in goats. So we renovated our house recently, and we had to like get rid of our chickens while it was happening, and just like totally broke our hearts.
Oh
So
yeah.
now we're trying to like decide on, okay, when do we want to bring the chickens back? But it's this type of thing. Anytime we like put food into the compost, we just like breaks our heart because we're like, the chickens would have loved this, because
Yeah,
the amazing thing about them is they're some of the greatest like garbage processors ever. I'm sure goats are probably like that too.
yeah.
But we would give our chickens everything. I mean, the dark secret here, people, is that one of chicken's favorite foods, chicken.
I know.
So
They love chicken McNuggets
chicken
from
bones, they'll
McDonald's.
they'll pick off those chicken bones, pick them clean. They eat meat, they eat everything. And it's like at the end of the day, then you have this like great compost.
Yeah.
So, and obviously then they make eggs out of it, and you have this like protein, which is like, oh my gosh, that you can have a source of protein as good as eggs with so little space and so little resources. It's just like mind blowing.
It really is. And chickens are another interesting thing about feeding chickens is also interesting too. So this time of year, I feed my chickens pretty actively
Mm-hmm.
because they're free range. As much as I possibly can. I have dogs that
Yeah,
love to spook them around, but I free range them in
sure.
the summer quite a bit. So that's basically free, which is
Mm-hmm.
crazy to think you can get
Do
that
you,
much.
do you not give them any feed during the summer?
Very little. If they're not laying heavily, I'll do more protein based feeds like sorghum
Okay.
or something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
But the interesting thing about chickens is that right now, like today's economy, today's capitalistic, which is just such a saying capitalism is a real kind of overstatement because there's a lot of nuance there. But
Yeah.
there are a few crops that are a negative economy, right?
Mm.
And most of them are chicken feed. So wheat, corn, soybeans, and
This is what
sorghum.
Colby talks about, actually.
Yeah, I've read this part in her book too, and it's
Yeah.
absolutely true. And those are the things I don't purchase for I purchase for my family. Like I wouldn't, for one thing, I'd need so much space to grow wheat
Yeah.
that it's not worth it to me. And I can actually buy it cheaper than I can grow it. And it's the same
Yeah.
thing with chicken food. So I can feed chickens cheaper than it is for me to almost feed them for free, which is so bizarre,
Yeah.
right? Like so. But if you have two chickens and you think that that's going to be this great economic boost for your life, and now you're not going to have to buy, like, that's not where you break even. Um,
Hmm.
and I mean, I last year I did. I have a friend who he volunteered last year to be the guy to keep all the meat birds,
Mm-hmm.
and so he bought 100 chicks. This is the first time I've done this. And then I took half
Interesting.
of them and we butchered them and we've eaten them, and it's just been fantastic.
So he grew them all.
He grew them.
You paid for part of them to
Uh-huh.
like. Okay.
Yep. And then
Awesome.
we both paid half on a I'm not sure what it's called, but it's basically a plucker. It's like
Mm-hmm.
a big tub, looks like an old washing machine with little fingers in
Yeah.
it, and it spins it around. Some stuff like that. So it's it's a little bit of an investment, and in the end, I don't think it saved us that much money. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Especially if I was just going to go and buy right off the shelf generic chicken.
Sure. Yeah.
If I was going to buy organic, like certified organic, then yeah, it's probably saved a lot of money. And these are organic, so that's nice too,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
but the the hens that my laying hens, I hate to say this, but they're like pets. Like we love them. Like
Yeah.
we know who they are. My daughters have named them all, and they're productive and fun, and they have personalities. So there's a little bit of that is a benefit as well. Um,
Sure.
and they're beautiful. Like I think they're really pretty birds.
So you track some of this stuff too, though? You tracking the numbers pretty close?
Yeah, yeah, yep.
So on eggs, the money like somehow getting cheap eggs. It's not like you're getting a great deal on eggs by having the laying hens.
In the summer it is,
Yeah.
but in the winter. So I have 15 birds right now, 15 laying
Okay.
hens right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I go through about a bag of 16% protein feed every 2 weeks. And
Okay.
that's $9 a bag
Mm-hmm.
if I buy it in like 200-pound quantities. Um, so, every 2 weeks I'm paying $9 for eggs, or to
Mm-hmm.
feed those eggs, and
Yeah.
I get about a dozen a day, right?
Gotcha.
So yeah, it's better than buying it at the store, but not
Mm-hmm.
much, right? Like
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking pennies on the dollar, and it's kind of the same thing that we see with like those negative economy crops, wheat,
Yeah.
right, where it's subsidized by the government so heavily that
Mm-hmm.
there's a whole lot there. There's a whole lot of process there about what we're doing to soil and how that's kind of irreparable and some things like
Yeah.
that too, which is kind of a different probably discussion. But goats, can I tell you goats real quick?
Yeah. Tell me about goats. Well, I'm trying to see if I had something else I wanted to ask about
Oh yeah,
chickens. Give me a second here. Okay. Yeah. But I just kind of wanted to reiterate. I think the discussion that's interesting still is like, well, how do you justify it? And this is the problem with the economy that we've built is things are always framed by price, as if the price is the only thing. And the metaphor that I like to use for it is it's like an investment portfolio. It's like in an investment portfolio, if you want to cover your butt, you can have some growth stocks, right? And the growth stocks are stuff that is going to kind of like deliver, but you want to have some stuff to hedge those stocks. You want to have some stocks just in case something happens when the growth stocks tank, you got something to cover your butt, right?
yeah,
And so I think sometimes with some of these things, we have the system of efficiency that's super efficient, right? Where they're sending crops from across the country, across the planet sometimes, huge industrialized manufacturing where they can make things incredibly efficient, just in time, inventory. So it's super, super efficient, but it is fragile. And so, you want to have something in place in case there are disruptions to that supply chain, which like we've already seen. Like I think with COVID, we kind of got pretty lucky, and maybe we're not out of the woods yet either. Like there's definitely a lot. I've been reading about how there's still a lot of disruptions going on, but it's I think it's a way of like hedging. It's like you talk about what you've done with these broiler hens, right? You've got those hens that you're raising for food, and it's like, you know how to do that. You know how awesome it is that, like, if something were to happen to our global chicken supply chain, that you can be like, well, okay, at least I know I can do this, right? And hey, maybe you'll be able to, like, sell some of those too. So yeah, I think there's good reason to be able to learn a little bit of food independence.
Yeah, I think to me the whole like concept of changing gardening from fun to food was a big thing for me, and the thing that if we're going to hit art, and I'm hoping we will eventually hit it,
we'll get there if everyone will be patient enough.
yeah, is that I think art taught me that trial and error is the only way to build a pattern towards success in an art career, and gardening is absolutely that for me.
Yeah.
Like I'm willing to jump in and try things that I have no idea if they'll be successful or not. Just because I know that if I don't try them out, I'd hate to be put in a position where they have to be successful and I don't know how to do it. So that's why I did the meat chickens this year. It's the first time I've done them. I'll do them forever because it was so easy, and I feel like it was a much more humane life for those chickens. And I know that's probably a justification. But I did feel like it was certainly better, and I'll do it forever.
No, I think that trial and error part of it is really important. I've definitely done gardening where it's just like, you have to deal with the fact. I mean, this is another thing that Colby kind of gets to. And I've heard other people talk about this, that like, okay, well, I'm going to reframe this. I'm going to take this to kind of like another level here, I guess, to like maybe a higher level. One of the concepts she talks about these like shadow cultures, and she kind of like is not crazy with the term, and I can kind of see why. But the whole idea is that we see this system that is problematic, that's having these malfunctions. We're kind of seeing it start to grind to a halt. We're seeing, people at the top kind of turning from innovating and creating value to just like extracting wealth out of the system. And so she kind of talks about this concept of like, okay, in the meantime, we're creating these experimental little shadow cultures. And the idea is that like the hope is, when this other thing finally collapses, we have other things ready to take its place. And it's a really cool idea because she kind of references historically how this happened historically. Like she talks about how like in the Roman Empire, there was all these little like cults, these experimental cults, and like Christianity was one of them. And as this one thing kind of like disintegrated, these other things were kind of poised to kind of grow out and take their place. And I guess this is why this kind of how it ties back to art. This is kind of the area I'm interested in art now. And I've been trying to like put my finger on it, like through this podcast. This is kind of one of the things this podcast has like helped me to do. That's the area I'm interested in, is like, I'm not crazy about what the culture of art is right now. And I definitely had frustrations trying to like fit into it. So I'm like really interested in this idea, just as with gardening and this like subsistence agriculture, of like, what sort of, experimental shadow cultures can we create with art that kind of can exist under the umbrella of this, technocratic capitalist thing that's going on right now, and that could potentially be something more at a later date, but also like, hey, you can find stuff that's amazing and generative and beautiful right now as well, right?
Yeah. Oh man, I love that. That's really, really interesting and super meaningful to me right now, like where I'm at in my life and thought with what I'm doing with my career. And, I'll give you an example of kind of where I'm starting to feel this is, I've published books with Macmillan and DC, right, and they've hit different levels of success. And the process has been good because there's something nice about being assigned an editor that's going to pound your book until it's right. So yeah. There's some really good intrinsic things there that I've learned and I've loved and have been very, very valuable to me. And working with DC was fun, but I was lucky enough to do an IP with them, and it was great. I had a good experience. And blame COVID, blame timing, blame whatever you want, but the book has not moved like at all.
Yeah.
And so I had
Hey,
another.
my kids love it, by the way.
Oh, that's
So
nice. When I get it into hands of people, I know they enjoy it, and so that's a
yeah.
that's a metric that keeps me happy.
Yeah.
But part of the reason for doing this book with them was for the opportunity to do one that I really wanted to do. That was another IP.
Yeah.
And so I had spent, I don't know, 5 or 6 months on this book pretty heavily. I had to make a cut that was beyond where I wanted to cut just because of
Ugh.
page economy. That's all it is.
Yeah.
I mean, literally
Yeah.
comes down to an
Ugh.
Excel spreadsheet. And I looked at the sales of what they were able to do if my characters didn't have a cape on, and nothing against. I mean, that's what DC does, right? They're excellent at selling what they sell. And then a whole bunch of kind of weird things have happened with DC and laid off people that I love, and I see all those things, and I had that same exact idea of why am I investing in the culture of publishing when I feel like publishing's on its way out. Like traditional straight up publishing is definitely struggling. And if some publisher listens to this podcast and think I'm a heretic, I'm so okay with that at this point.
Yeah.
Because I've decided to pull my book from DC.
Interesting.
And that was a tough decision, right? Like, I know there's people who would give their eye teeth to have a chance to shoot something out with DC, and I was in that position and decided it's just not the right fit.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, when we talked to them about it, they totally understood. Matter of fact, they kind of agreed. They're like, yeah, we're probably not the right people for this. And, those are tough decisions to do. But the big thing that I've been thinking is, if I'm going to do that, I certainly don't want to just go back and get into another relationship with a publisher that's going to be the same culture. Because I don't think it's DC's fault. I think it's way more systemic.
Yeah.
And so I'm starting to have those thoughts now of, is there a better way for me to share my content? Whether there's a financial side of that, I don't know.
Yeah.
But there might be a more satisfying way to do it for building a different community.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on the same, maybe the same train I've been thinking along lately. I mean, 10 years ago, the answer would have been like, hey, well, now we have the internet,
right?
And I heard this interesting thing from Weinstein the other day.
Yeah.
I don't know if you listen to him at all. He's a interesting guy. Seems like he's kind of got a bone to pick, but
now I'm making
he is a really interesting kind of heterodox thinker. But he has this idea of, let's see if I can get it right, that the idealism of an era like covers up the corruption of that same era, if that makes sense.
Wow.
And you'll have to listen to his whole and the first example he uses is Manifest Destiny, which gets the point across probably as clear as anyone else, right? It's like the idealism of Manifest Destiny covers up the horrible crimes that were committed to gobble up land. But he kind of comments how like the internet age had this idealism of like this internet utopia, right? And there's been kind of this corruption hiding underneath that. Not that I feel kind of bad because I can't really describe exactly what that is, but I certainly have felt like I feel like the gas is kind of going out on it. There's a time where it's like, yeah, you can go on the internet, you don't need a publisher anymore, and people are kind of seeing now that like, yeah, it's a little bit of a Pyrrhic dream there as far as how far the internet can take you.
Yeah.
But I have been thinking of things in the same way, like as far as I want to find a meaningful community where I can share my art and find a way where I can do it sustainably. What the economic model is for that, or whether it's one that eschews an economic model, I don't know. But like those are the things I want to find. I don't know. And maybe it's going to be like gardening, that it's just like you gotta get some aphids on your Brussels sprouts a few times before you figure out how it's going to work,
Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And boy, that's something like I said, I'm so at the beginning of this. I have no idea what the answers are. I have some concepts of maybe kind of how I'm treating things more like properties rather than titles. So for example, like, if I have a concept for a book or a book series that I enjoy, I think I could enjoy writing for a long period of time, there might be potential outlets through YouTube that might help with that better than
Yeah.
than the book proper. Or there might be different ways for me to tell that story. And some of that admittedly comes from writing that previous book about kind of the evolution of technology and kind of seeing some of the goods and bads there that have happened. And, even looking at things like, I mean, we've certainly moved on to faster and quicker forms of communication.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Twitter and TikTok, etc. There's like, as micro as we can possibly make micro. It's not really storytelling. It's actually just entertainment. And while it's it's super satisfying. It's not the same as storytelling. And so that's a little bit anti-evolutionary, because storytelling is such an important part of our evolution, right? It contains warnings, and it contains, all kinds of lessons that we learn. It's how trial and error works. We love stories about people who fail because it teaches us how to succeed, and all of those things. And when we get to a point with something like Twitter, where you can have literally millions of different opinions fly past your eye in a month, it's really hard to. There's some level where we shouldn't probably even have that much information.
Yeah.
And so I think as humans, at least, I mean, this is so anecdotal, right? It's me. Right? Like, I feel like I can't process all of that to a point where I don't want to anymore.
That's universal, man. That's not anecdotal. That is like the zeitgeist. It's just this overwhelm. Yeah. They talk about this problem. It's the sense making crisis, and this gets to story. Like you talk about story, that this purpose that story had, mostly embedded within religion for eons, it was a way of sense making. It was a way of telling you when A happens, then you should do B, or it means B. When A happens, it means B. And then that helps you to say, like, okay, then if A means B, then I should do C, right? It helps us to understand the world and navigate the world. And we're at this point where it's just like, there's so much stuff coming at us that we can't like meaningfully process it. So, still to be figured out what the heck we do about that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I mean, and there's one of the ways the kind of directions I've kind of gone with that is getting more to like this hyper local orientation. And you made this comment of like, how did you say it? Maybe this is just anecdotal.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like we kind of need to go back to being hyper anecdotal, where it's like, I need to go back and be like, okay, what do I really know? And go to the very, very basics and this gets back to gardening, right?
Right.
And to be like, okay, what do I know about my body? What do I know about my own mind? What do I know about my environment that's immediate to me?
What do I know about my land?
Say that again.
What do I know about my land?
Yeah. What do you know about your land?
Yeah.
And really nail down the stuff that is like that's closest to you that you can really be sure about. And then it starts going into relationships, like, okay, what do I like? How can I build this relationship with my wife and my children that's rock solid and that's producing goodness? And I don't know. I feel like the start is someplace there. Is kind of like getting back to these things, and maybe it's a matter of then kind of building shadow cultures off of that, or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think a lot of people have honestly just been really disconnected from just the facts of their like basic existence,
I think you're absolutely right. And, when you mentioned in an email, we wanted to talk about gardening to me, and the place that I was talking to my wife about this, about saying, the thing that I like about gardening is that it hits the very basis of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where it comes down to. And I feel like, like I said, the winter months for me are for writing, and the hot summer months are for drawing for me. And spring and fall end up being pretty, demanding as far as my time in the yard. And part of that is that I spend those 6 months of the year in the fall and in the spring really preparing to buy myself time by fulfilling that entire base of that hierarchy of needs.
So you're talking about safety. It's like
Yeah,
basic human safety.
yeah.
Yes.
And when those things aren't solid, I have a really hard time being able to focus on higher order things. And
Absolutely.
art is constant correction. We've probably talked.
Mm-hmm.
I think you and I have actually talked about that. Like the amount of concentration it takes to really do something that is meaningful to you personally
Mm-hmm.
requires this constant correction, this constant. It's really tough stuff.
Yeah.
It's just not easy. And gardening is tough in a very different way, right? It's physically
Mm-hmm.
demanding, and it requires patience. And you can see problems happening at this slow, 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 wonderfully slow speed. And you're like, oh, I know I'm getting leaf rot on my tomatoes. I know it's coming, but I've got 3 or 4 days to really address it. Like, boy, in art, you don't get that.
No. Yeah.
and and so there is this kind of balance thing there, but I really do feel like that's part of it, is that once I kind of have that base, that root safety kind of handled, it
Yeah.
allows me to do those things. And a question that she had to me, she's like, all right, you can only do one. You can quit art or you can quit gardening. What would you quit?
Hmm.
Right? It's one of those impossible questions, but the sad thing is, I guess I'd have to quit art.
Hmm.
I don't know
Yeah.
that I'd be happy, but
Mm-hmm.
I'd be safe. It's an interesting thing. And when I look at like global food production
Yeah.
and how difficult that is for some people to afford, and I mean a big portion globally.
Oh yeah.
And even if I look locally, my wife teaches at a school that's got kids who just don't have food,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I look at it and go, man, I can't believe we're telling these kids to buy books, even though
Yeah.
that's so important, right? It is so important.
Yeah.
When they'll take a lunch home Friday from the school that's provided that has enough food for that
Oh.
kid to go for the whole weekend, and
Hmm.
it has to go to the whole family.
Oh
Right?
geez.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something that's really, really painful to see too, is that the culture of subsistence has really disappeared. I mean, that used to be the way that if you had no other option, I mean, you grew your own food, but now it's like, the people that are most vulnerable are the most dependent, and like we can try to like look down on them, but it's like all they have are like the options that they have. Sometimes all they have is Walmart. All they have is like junk food, you
Absolutely.
know?
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
I remember one time I was working at EA, and they
mm-hmm.
early on they provided hot dogs and a cup of noodles in the cafeteria. Right, take
Yeah.
as many as you want.
Yeah.
And somebody made some joke about saying, oh, they found an article that's like, here are the 5 worst foods for you to eat. And those were two of the foods on it. We're making this huge kind of joke about it. And we're like, yeah, maybe we should stop doing this. And EA
Yeah.
stopped doing that. And then they started providing breakfast cereal, which was probably another one of those 5 foods.
Pretty bad too. Yeah.
But the joke was, well, the reason they do that is because it's the cheapest food. And then I
Yep.
thought, oh my gosh, that's so true and so unfair to people who are like, that's as good as I can get. The worst 5 foods for me are the only ones I can afford.
Yeah.
That's a real reality for a lot of people. And gardening's not cheap. Access to
Mm,
land is a
not
massive
cheap.
problem. Yeah,
Yeah.
and even there's community gardens down here that are free for the taking. You can go ahead
Mm,
and put your stuff down here. You pay, if you can, you pay for water. If not, the city will pay for it. And people just don't do it. Like they're
yeah.
they're empty.
Well, I mean, it's investment, even learning the skill. I mean, these things that used to be passed down, and it's knowledge that's been lost. And
Yeah,
so, and I'm sure these people are so overburdened with other things as well, especially at the lower ends of the economic spectrum, that it's like, how are they going to be able to afford the trial and error necessary
that's
to learn what they
exact.
have to learn?
It's
You know?
years of investment.
Yeah. Geez. Man, you know what really strikes me as you're talking about this is you talk about Maslow's hierarchy of need.
Yeah.
And here we are, people that exist at like this high, especially compared to the rest of the world. We're the 1%
Oh,
compared to
for
the rest
sure.
of the
Yeah.
world. And it is really scary that we still don't feel completely stable when it comes to that base layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about the world where even the best off people are insecure about their most basic needs, feel insecure about that,
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's so true. I understand why a lot of people freaked out and bought toilet paper during the COVID thing,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
get it. I really do understand it. And I think the main reason is that we live in a very, very immediate culture. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my little tiny Ephraim down here, right? Like our Walmart's way smaller than, obviously big city thing. But you know
Yeah.
what? They maybe get 3 trucks a week. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
maybe they get 5. I don't know. I don't know. If they're getting 5 a week, holy cow, we churn through a lot of content or a lot of product in this tiny little town.
Yeah.
And like you said, you go 2 weeks without that. What's going to be gone and what's going to be important is a
What's
really
going to replace it?
question. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of doomsday people out there that are like, oh, peak oil,
Yeah.
and it's like you can poo-poo them, or you can say like, oh, we'll figure out something else. But you also have to consider, okay, but what if that doesn't happen?
Right.
And what if something else happens that we're not expecting? Like case in point, COVID, even though we actually should have seen it coming, but
Yeah.
um, yeah, what if, boy, this is getting depressing.
I know.
Hey, you're going to tell me about goats. So
Okay.
let's go back and talk about goats. I think that's a great place to take it.
Okay. So goats are annoying and
Uh-huh.
they're noisy. Um, but two things goats do that chickens don't. So one thing we're going to talk about poop. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it, man.
So there's only two domesticated animals that we have that have what's called cold manure. So that
Huh.
means manure that you can put on the garden immediately.
Oh,
It doesn't have to
interesting.
rest. And so goat and rabbit are the only two domesticated animals that you can do that.
So explain that. Is the other stuff, it has like too high of a nitrogen content? Is that it? And it kind of needs some time to dissipate a little bit?
Exactly. And chickens,
Yeah.
you talked about compost, like not only do
Yeah.
chickens eat your compost, but they're fantastic at making compost, right?
Yes.
They
Yes.
stir the earth, they move it around, they do all those different things. And that's great. Like that's really good for soil prep, but it takes a
Yeah.
year to do that. And so if you don't have a really good place to store what your chickens are
Mm-hmm.
doing to your yard or inside their pen, then it can be kind of smelly, it gets a problem, all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Goats, like you can take their poop the day they drop it and throw it directly into your live compost, or you can throw it directly into your garden. They
Hmm.
are fantastic soil prep. Um,
Hmm.
so I have just got a couple little tiny guys,
Mm-hmm.
and I rotate them to a couple different places in the yard with fence, and I just let them poop directly on it, and it's fantastic for soil regeneration.
Ah.
So that's the
So the kind of areas you're keeping them, those become
plant.
you kind of rotate garden beds onto those later.
Yeah. Or
Awesome.
I'll take the top 3 or 4 inches out of a pen and put it directly into a bed. And I garden with a method called no-till gardening,
Okay.
which is a kind of a. I mean, it's not terribly new. It's probably 20 years of
For everything you do.
Yeah, I don't dig.
Hmm.
Very 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 little, like as little
Mm-hmm.
as possible. Um,
Okay.
and part of that's just to keep like worm cultures and all kinds of things that these like you're underneath the soil is a pretty live culture. It's a very very live thing, and sticking a shovel down in there can really cause some damage to soil nutrients and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So I don't do that. So I'll take goat manure and I can put it directly on top of things, and add really really good nutrition to my soil. Can't
So
do
what do
that
you do?
since I have to dig in
Yeah.
or wait a year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you kind of have to. That's kind of the cycle I'm on. Is I make a compost pile and it sits for a year and then it goes into my garden like the next year. Um, so with no-till, what do you do with like the dead plants at year's end? Do you just knock them down, or do you like cut them off and like compost most of
Yeah,
them?
I'll
Like how do you
compost
deal with
most of
like?
them or feed them to the goats and
Okay,
chickens.
do you actually pull them out, or do you like leave us? So you pull them out,
Yeah, I pull them out. Yeah,
but you're not digging after. You're not like tilling after that.
no. Mm-mm.
Yeah.
And it's
Okay.
it's taken a while to like condition the soil to kind of get to a point where it's conditioned enough to do that. Like
Mm-hmm.
most of the soil in Utah is super high clay content, and so
Mm-hmm.
especially I don't know down here where I am, it's very high clay content. So it's taken a long time to put enough additives into the soil to kind of change that. Plants are great at that. The roots just
Yeah.
go down there and break it up and do a better job. But it's, like I said, time consuming. It takes a couple of years to really kind of get to a point where you have kind of healthy areas. And it's shocking how fast you can drain the nutrition out of soil.
Really?
Yeah, and so that's when you see like massive, massive farms, and we talk about people saying, "I don't know, you're so worried about organic versus non-organic." The organic isn't really what goes into the plants. It's or the non-organic problems aren't what goes into the plants. It's the non-organic
Yes.
stuff that we put into the soil
Yes.
that's toxic, and toxic's a pretty strong term. It's not toxic.
But it's all ends up being runoff that's going into our ecosystem
That's where it's
everywhere.
problematic. Yeah,
It's like the farming that happens in Iowa affects like the wetlands in New
yeah,
Orleans,
isn't that crazy? Yeah,
So, and yeah, there's a whole thing about like how the storm surge in the Hurricane Katrina was so horrible because there'd just been this erosion of the wetlands that used to be this buffer that used to absorb all that. And that's like a direct result of kind of this all of this runoff. And it's I'm sure it's more things than just fertilizer,
sure.
but it affects that.
Yeah, it's definitely a
Um,
huge part of it.
yeah.
Yeah,
But then there's also like we're also deteriorating this, like degrading the soil. I think that's also something that Colby probably talks about is just like degrading the soil to where it's like, okay, what are we going to grow out of this soil? Once we've like stripped it
yeah. I mean,
so bare of nutrients.
yeah, not to be terribly depressing, but it's not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, it really honestly isn't. And, the funny thing is, it's not sustainable on either side. It's not sustainable in, like big, massive farming type stuff. Like, eventually we'll
Yeah.
get a point with the soil where the only way we can do it is to go strictly hydroponics,
Mm-hmm.
which are very nutrient bare. It's food, it's consumable, and it'll fill your
Mm-hmm.
belly, but it's very nutrient bare. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then even on the rural side of things, like it's really not sustainable either. I think it's probably easier on a rural side if we take that kind of, like you mentioned, like very small, very personal
Mm-hmm.
approach to this kind of stuff. But if
Yeah.
if I would hate to try to be to make my living as a farmers market down here. I think it'd be really
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's so easy when you're like in the city to kind of like idealize, farming and to be like, we get a CSA during the summer and like it's fantastic. Like we love the stuff we get in the CSA, but there is always this question of like, how sustainable is this? How well could this take the place of something else if it collapsed? Um, Actually, it's funny. I have a friend that I was talking about this with, and he said like, "Oh, it's like performance agriculture. It's like
Uh,
they're putting on this show, and that's what the product is. The product is the performance. It isn't actually the food that you're that you're buying."
that is so true. Well, the whole YouTube culture for like people who have homesteads and farmsteads on YouTube, that's definitely a big part of that.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah,
You think there's some BS going on there?
for sure. And there's
Yeah.
people who make enough money off of that type of stuff. They're getting 300,000, 400,000 views a day, and they're putting up a video every day.
Hmm.
And then they'll show you like a new thing that they've put in. You're like, geez, Louise, like that. You just built a hoop house that would cost 20 grand. Like that's not something I can justify, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to that. Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, but I mean, you talk about sustainability, and I think one of the key things is this kind of like one of the problems with having our food grown so distantly from us, and for a lot of things happening distant from us, is just we miss this feedback that you get as working in your own garden, right? That you see those problems immediately.
Yeah.
And this is a problem in so many areas of our society is we have to create all these regulations and all these other things because there are all these ethical implications of these systems we depend on that are happening thousands of miles away from us,
Right.
So it's like, why are people being exploited in Vietnam? Well, it's because, we are wearing the clothes that they are making, and we don't see what's going on there. So like, how easy is it for us to make adjustments when we can see the horrible, what's going on that's wrong? And the same with growing food in Iowa or wherever, and there's soil degradation and there's runoff and all these things. And it's like, I don't see that. All I see is like corn on the grocery shelf, and by the time the problems emerge, it's way far down the line. It's like I see food disappear and it's just like, oh, I don't know what to do now. I'm screwed. The corn's gone, the best I've got is to check another store,
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And those problems are getting more dramatic because of the amount of people who are actually producing food is reducing so much too.
Oh
So
yeah.
less than 1% of American people produce food for the entire country.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy. It's definitely a dying art. And I think part of the reason why it's dying is because, I mean, this is so me making up everything at this point, but I can imagine that it's difficult to create a product knowing that you're getting paid a subsidy for your hard work. Like, I don't know
Sure.
how to explain that. It's because it's valuable. There's a huge amount of value to creating things like soybean and corn and all those things.
Sure.
But, the majority of it goes to, it's tough. I'll just say that. It's really tough. And
it makes me think of, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, we don't do very much like vegetable gardening in the United States anymore. The bulk of it are those economy neutral or economy negative products. That's the only thing we can afford to grow here.
Yeah, I think you kind of touch on something interesting, and I heard this comment from James Kunstler, who's a writer, a really cantankerous guy, but his integrity is just like spot on. He has this famous YouTube video. I think it's one of the best things. My favorite, or it's a TED Talk, one of the best TED Talks ever, where he just talks about just like how all the problems with kind of like suburban culture, which I highly recommend checking out. But I was listening to a podcast with him, and he was talking about how he was driving through like, I don't know, somewhere in Ohio or Pennsylvania, some like Amish territory, and how he was driving by this like Amish work crew with, horse-drawn machines, they're bucking bales, they're picking up hay or whatever. And it's this like whole work crew. And he sees that and he's like, you can see kind of the camaraderie, these people working together, tilling their land. And then it's like a few miles later, he's driving by some guy in a massive combine, driving through fields of corn or whatever.
Wow.
And like with the technology now, with those machines, it's like, if you're a farmer, you don't know how to fix them. You have to have these specialists that know how to fix them. You're going to be sitting in your air conditioned, combine, watching Netflix while you're doing this job. And it's like, even the farmers themselves have been like abstracted out of the process of farming as much as possible, but there's none of that camaraderie of working with others, right? They're by themselves, being isolated and wanting to kill themselves, just like every other American, binging in their homes. But yeah, even that is sad.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Boy, talk about contrast.
Yeah. Maybe we need to go back to goats.
Yeah.
We keep going. We just keep going down to the really depressing places, man.
Goats are cute, so that's good too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's good. Let's bring it back. We should bring it back to art a little bit. I mean, I guess all of this is to say, I am super interested in kind of this idea of like what comes next, and just it's easy to idealize it and say like, okay, let's create this alternative, even though, like you say, I think there's some harsh realities to it, but there's something kind of exciting of just saying like, okay, maybe I don't have to be part of this system that I'm not crazy about,
Yeah. It's interesting because I never thought I'd be at this point. The main reason I wanted to go traditional publishing was because I had a full-time job, which all writers do, have some other source of income, whether it's investing or whatever that is. I'll always have something like that. So I thought, I'd rather have somebody that can help me with the stuff I don't know. Distribution.
Yeah.
That's always a big
Yeah.
question for me. How do I find people in marketing? And to find out that that's really not their concern either, and that I'm responsible for all that, makes me kind of think, well, maybe I should be trying to build a better ecosystem to to publish and promote my own work. And I'm horrible at
Yeah.
it. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, like I'll put something on Instagram and get like 30 likes and look at it and go, oh man, I know what I could have done to make that get more reach,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm just bad at it. Like I have to be able to
I know the
understand.
drill.
Yeah, right. It's frustrating. Um, so I've kind of been thinking this whole thing about like what really is the product. I don't want it to be me.
Yeah.
I'm not an entertainer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but the real truth is that I love the process of creating enough that I know I won't stop until I've either cracked that nut or come to the most important conclusion to me, which is to honestly not care if people buy my work. And that's a tough one.
Yeah.
That's one I know. Talk about Twitter. I know I actually got a note from my agent after I did that. So I think you're a little too honest.
Yeah.
But I do kind of, that is my biggest desire, is to lose that need to sell.
Yeah.
Which is tough when you have to monetize it somehow.
Yeah. Man, I totally know where you're coming from. Well, there's two parts of it. It's like, it's also, you want to know that your voice is being heard, you know? This has been a really hard thing for me as I've tried to step away from social media, has been just like, okay, but there's like a need that serves. Like I have a voice. I want to be part of a community where my voice is like means something.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure everyone wants, you know? So that's part of what I think about is like, okay, there's a sustainability. Can I do this in such a way where I can still survive as I do this? And there's also like, I want people that I can meaningfully exchange ideas with.
Yeah.
Or that appreciate my work, or where that means something in my community.
Yeah, I totally 100% agree. It's interesting to me because I've just today on Twitter. So you mentioned you're trying to get on social media, but me too. I'm not up there ever. I just check it every day.
I'm still like, oh, I guess still got to go to. That's still my one thing is Twitter. It's like I'm still like, feel like I can't leave. But
yeah, I feel like the news finds me. It's the news that I want, and of course I recognize that's an echo chamber, all those things. But I follow a certain group of people that kind of bring me the stuff I want to think about, and I have that desire to have some sort of a town hall experience, and I feel like Twitter can be kind of in that area. But today it was kind of going a little bit wonky, at least in the circles that I run in, about some writer wrote something about, here's the harsh reality, writers. I don't know if you saw the harsh reality meme that was the other day. We said the harsh reality is that all of these people who say you're friends, your other writers, are your competition, is what he said. And people went kind of nuts on it and they're like, actually, no, that's not the harsh reality. The harsh reality is that you probably need a better community. Like your community should be your support system. And I love that concept. And, I'm the kind of guy that will